Sorry about that, guys. I apologize for my technological difficulties. That happens every now and then. But progressives are working to reduce the power of political bosses. They're trying to establish public control of natural monopolies. So when your book refers to natural monopolies, they're talking about things such as gas. Okay, and water. They want to improve public transportation. Okay. Um, Hiram Johnson, who was the governor of California in 1910, ends up passing the Public Utilities Act. So, this is a progressive move. It was one of the nation's strongest railroad regulation measures. If we recall, a couple of chapters ago, we talked about, I know, maybe it was last chapter, we talked about the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission or the ICC. This will aid the ICC. Okay. What are some other reforms? What is progressive democracy at this time? What types of reform do we see during the progressive era? We have the Wisconsin idea, which is introduced in this era. The Wisconsin idea called for nominations of candidates through primary elections rather than political bosses. So they're trying to free politics of its corruption. So if you want to be a candidate, the people have to choose you to be a candidate, not one person who says, "Oh, I like you, you're going to be this candidate." So it gives the people a little more power. It's during the Progressive Era in 1912 that we see the ratification of the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment states that senators are to be chosen by popular vote. This is another example of power being taken from political bosses and it being handed to the people. Again, like I spoke of in the second, in part two of this series, even though the progressive era, we you see lots of discrimination, there are people who are fighting against it. So some of this discrimination are the restrictions on democratic participation, and the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South. So it's also during the progressive era, while you in the North you have a lot of great things going on, in the South, you know, blacks, while constitutionally and nationally you have the right to vote, you're still not able to vote because there are literacy tests. You have the grandfather clause, which stated that if your grandfather was able to vote before the Civil War, so were you, as well as poll taxes. Um, Electoral changes of this era really represented this significant or a significant reversal of the idea that voting was an inherent right of American citizenship. So when you see electoral challenges like this, where there's disfranchisement in the South, it really reverses the idea that voting is an inherent right of American citizenship. Do we see this today? Yes, with the addition of voter restrictions or voter ID laws. It really says that voting is not a right of citizenship, but a privilege of citizenship. So we will go on to speak about Jane Addams and Hull House, and then we'll talk about women's suffrage. Okay, so Jane Addams was a woman and who really believed that women were more than wives and they were more than mothers. In 1889, she founded Hull House in Chicago, Illinois, and the purpose of Hull House was to improve the lives of the immigrant poor. They built kindergartens. They built and established employment bureaus. They built health clinics, and they would help female victims of domestic violence gain legal protection, which is something that's really huge during this era. These settlement houses, were often referred to as spearheads of reform because they would produce a number of progressive era figures. So by 1900, more than 80 or there were more than 80,000 college educated women in the United States. So prior, so okay, The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association will merge, okay, to create the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. So it was founded in 1890, but by 1917, they have more than 2 million members. So women's suffrage was something, or women having the right to vote, is something that had been on the minds of American women since really prior to the emancipation and the abolition of slavery. So women's suffrage is something that has been on the minds of women and has been in the American imagination for quite a while. And the National American Woman Suffrage Association will campaign for the right to vote. Now, as I said before, the National American Woman Suffrage Association resulted from the merger of two organizations. So, the National Woman Suffrage Association, or the NWSA, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, or the AWSA. The NWSA was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they favored women's enfranchisement through the establishment of like a national amendment. So they felt that in order for women to get suffrage, there needed to be some nationwide law that would it would just be signed into law. On the other hand, the AWSA, or the American Woman Suffrage Association, was led by Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and Julia Ward Howe, and they believed that women should gain the right to vote through a more like grassroots, local, and state, like a state by state campaign. So while both of these organizations they both campaigned for the right of women to vote, they just believed that they should go about it in a different way. But by 1890, these two organizations merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And after 1920, when women gained the right to vote, it is transformed to become the League of Women Voters. Because again, now women have suffrage. And so now we have to focus on protecting that right. And so the National American Woman Suffrage Association will transform into the League of Women Voters after 1920. So there is a number, or I would say there is some maternalist reform that happens during this time as well. Maternalist reform is this idea that the state had an obligation to protect women and children. It encouraged women's capacity for childbearing and for raising children, but also enabled them to be economically independent. So, a case that is discussed in your text is Muller versus Oregon, which occurs in 1908. But in order to understand Muller versus Oregon, we have to go back to 1903. So, in 1903, Oregon passed a law stating that women could not work more than 10 hours a day in factories and laundry. So it's this idea that because women are less capable of this type of work, they have a limit on working hours, no more than 10 hours a day in factories and in laundries. However, women at Muller's Laundry, women were required to work more than 10 hours a day. So it goes to court, and in 1908, in Muller versus Oregon, a maximum a, a set number, or there's a maximum working hours set for women. Okay, so because the idea is that women have less strength than men and they have less endurance than men, that working for them, working long hours was dangerous for them. And so in Muller versus Oregon 1908, maximum working hours are set for women. Okay, so now we'll kind of transition to some political fun stuff. Okay, so the progressive presidents. So in 1900, we have William McKinley, and he passes, for example, the Gold Standard Act. But McKinley isn't president for very long. In 1901, William McKinley is assassinated. And so his vice president is Theodore Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt will end up taking the reins. Roosevelt really gives us, I would say, a great example of a modern 20th century president because he is very active, he is very engaged in domestic and foreign policies. So, one thing that Roosevelt will attempt, or one thing he'll put in place, is his square deal. So, the square deal attempted to distinguish between good corporations and bad corporations. So, Roosevelt, in our kind of historical memory, is known as a trust bird. I cannot speak today. A trust buster. He really wanted to break up these trusts and these monopolies that controlled a lot of America's economy. So, for example, a couple of chapters ago, when we were talking about the Gilded Age and some of these barons of industry, one that I mentioned was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of the nation's oil industry by 1900. That is a monopoly, and he would engage in unfair business practices. So, during this time, if you wanted to compete with Standard Oil, it was pretty impossible because anyone who stepped on the stage to try to compete, he would just simply buy them out. So, um, Theodore Roosevelt, sorry for the brain. Uh, Theodore Roosevelt will prosecute Northern Securities Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So, the Sherman Antitrust Act banned all combinations and practices that restricted free trade. So, Northern Securities was ordered to be dissolved in 1904, and this is one of the reasons why Theodore Roosevelt is known as a trust buster. He will go after a number of these huge companies. Um, Theodore Roosevelt is also known for a lot of his preservation. So he was very involved in wildlife preserves and the creation of our national parks. As America industrialized, he really feared that the what was wild and beautiful about America would disappear. So under Roosevelt, we get the creation of wildlife preserves as well as national parks. However, put an asterisk there as well, because in creating these national parks, it also required the removal of Native Americans. So yeah, put an asterisk uh, right there. So that's yeah. Moving on. In 1904, it was time for re-election, and Theodore Roosevelt, or TR as I'll call him, he ran for president. He was re-elected. So he becomes president in his own right at this time. And so during I guess you could say it was his first full term as president, you'll see a lot more federal regulation of the economy, and one thing that you'll hear, or you won't hear him say because he's been dead for many years, but one thing that he would say, or one thing that he condemned was, quote, the misuse of vast power conferred by vast wealth. You know, he did not like the idea that you have a few people who have so much money that they can control the entire American economy. It's something that he really disagreed with. In 1906, he passes the Hepburn Act, and the Hepburn Act gives the ICC more power. So, the purpose of the ICC was to examine railroads to make sure that the rates that they charged farmers and merchants to transport their goods, the ICC would make sure those prices were reasonable and fair. With the Hepburn Act in 1906, it gives the ICC more power to examine railroads' business records, and it gave the government the right to set reasonable rates if those rates were not reasonable. So TR's vice president was William Howard Taft, and they became pretty good friends while he was president. And so William Howard Taft is basically handpicked by TR to be his successor. And he will pursue antitrust policy really more aggressively than Roosevelt. So it's under Taft that that Rockefeller's Standard Oil is declared to be in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Taft will also support the 16th Amendment, which was a gradual income tax that is higher for wealthier citizens. Wow, what a new thing. Wealthier citizens paying a bit more in taxes. But that is something that Taft will support, a gradual tax that's higher for the nation's wealthiest citizens. However, there are some other, I'll say, minor issues that he and TR will disagree with. And uh, when the election of 1912 comes along, it's pretty contentious. Ugh. And I'll say it's pretty contentious and it ends up being pretty messy. So, unable to sit on the sidelines, Theodore Roosevelt ends up jumping into the election of 1912 alongside William Howard Taft. And so it ends up being a four-way election. So the election of 1912 is between Eugene Debs, who is running as a socialist. You have Woodrow Wilson, who is running as a Democrat. You have Taft, who is running as a Republican. And then you have Roosevelt, who was a Republican, but he ends up running under the Progressive Bull Moose Party. So, what Roosevelt does in the election of 1912 essentially is split the Republican vote. It doesn't matter if you're running under a progressive party, you were the president and people know you as a Republican. And so it splits the Republican vote and essentially ensures that no Republican gets the majority. And so you have, again, Taft as a Republican, Roosevelt as a progressive, but of course, many people are going to know him as a Republican, Woodrow Wilson as a Democrat, and Eugene Debs, who is a socialist. So Taft really believes that government and private entrepreneurs had to cooperate in addressing a lot of these societal ills. Eugene Debs believes that there should be public ownership of railroads. There should be public ownership of the banking system. There should be government aid to those who are unemployed and laws that would establish work hours and a minimum wage. And then you have Woodrow Wilson, who believes that, yeah, we need to free government from the domination of big businesses. So, because Roosevelt kind of jumps in there and he splits the Republican vote, Wilson ends up winning with only 42% of the vote. So he doesn't need a huge majority in order to win because there are so many candidates in the ring, in the wings there. So in Wilson's first term, he passes some important pieces of legislation. So I'll go through them really quickly. So first is the Underwood Tariff, also known as the Revenue Act of 1913. This reduced the average tariff on imported goods and reimposed the federal income tax. He also passed the Clayton Act of 1914, which exempted labor unions from antitrust laws. It also barred courts from issuing injunctions curtailing the right to strike. Wilson will also pass the Keating-Owen Act in 1916, which outlawed child labor. So again, we are in an era of child labor. It's not until 1916 with the passage of the Keating-Owen Act that child labor is outlawed. And one of the last that we'll talk to, or no, the last that we'll talk about today is the Adamson Act, which was also passed in 1916. This would establish an 8-hour workday on the nation's railroads. Okay, very important, on the nation's railroads. But if you work in a factory or in a laundry or something like that, it did not impact you. Okay, you guys, that is the progressive era. If you have any questions, send me an email or type them below, and I'll do my best to answer. All right, see you guys later.